Okay, thank you, Ricky, for your introductory remarks, and Trevor, and thank you everyone for being here today. This panel will focus on natural resources under the next administration with a specific lens on federal policy. These issues, we think, are critically important. Federal lands and waters managed by the Department of the Interior comprise more than 1/5 of the country's landmass and 1.7 billion offshore acres, and are the source for almost 30% of annual domestic energy production, as well as a significant source for domestic greenhouse gas emissions, which contribute to climate change. In addition to the Department of the Interior, this panel is going to discuss policies managed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is responsible for developing and executing federal laws related to agriculture, forestry, and food, including assisting with the sale of crops and food on the domestic and global markets, and administering the nation's 174 national forests and grasslands, which encompass nearly 200 million acres through the U.S. Forest Service. So the Obama administration took several important actions to help modernize the programs of both Interior and Agriculture, including, as Ricky mentioned, launching a programmatic review of the federal coal leasing process and issuing a moratorium on new coal leases. But the fate of all these programs remains unclear today. It's fair to say that there are many known or likely actions that the Trump administration may take within the realm of natural resources, but there are also many unknown actions. So we are really in a new frontier. For example, Trump has publicly expressed support for both more coal production and fracking for natural gas, which the market tells us may sometimes be contradictory goals. And despite a general affinity for infrastructure, he has not been a vocal supporter for renewable energy, although public lands do offer enormous potential for renewable energy production and sites for wind and solar. But I have with me today some of the best and brightest experienced lawyers and policy experts to help us navigate this new frontier. And I very much look forward to hearing their thoughts on what we can expect in the final days of the Obama administration, what to expect in the early stages of a Trump administration, and how policy experts and advocates might continue to advance their agenda in this new and challenging political landscape. So first, to my right, I am very pleased to welcome David Hayes, and I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the components of each of my panelists' bios. Their full bios are in your packet of materials. David Hayes is a distinguished visiting lecturer in law at the Stanford Law School, where he has been teaching courses focused on renewable and conventional energy, wildlife trafficking, NEPA reform, natural resources, and climate change. He is a consulting professor at Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, chair of the U.S. Wildlife Trafficking Alliance, and vice chair of the President's Advisory Council on Wildlife Trafficking. Prior to teaching at Stanford, Hayes served as the Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the Department of the Interior for Presidents Clinton and Obama from 1999 to 2001 and 2009 to 2013, respectively. As the Senate confirmed #2 official at Interior, he had line authority over Interior's 70,000 employees, $14 billion budget, and the department's 10 major bureaus and agencies. Hayes focused on energy, climate change, conservation, and Indian issues during his 2 tours of duty at Interior. He was a key leader in facilitating the approval of more than 13,000 megawatts of renewable energy projects on public lands and offshore waters, and he led the Interior Department's Climate Change and Energy Task Force. He also served as a point person during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Prior to serving as Deputy Secretary of the Interior, he was a leader in President Obama's transition team. He headed up the Energy and Environmental Agency review process, selecting and overseeing transition teams embedded in the departments of Energy, Agriculture, and EPA. To David's right, Ignacia Moreno is the Chief Executive Officer and founding principal of the iMoreno Group, a law firm that offers legal services and strategic counseling on environmental and natural resources matters. that arise in the context of regulatory compliance, enforcement proceedings, litigation, business transactions, and government relations. During her 26-year career, she has served as the top environmental lawyer at the U.S. Department of Justice, been a corporate environmental counsel at a Fortune 10 company, and practiced environmental law and litigation at prominent national law firms. In 2009, President Obama nominated Ms. Moreno to serve as Assistant Attorney General of the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. She served as head of that division from 2009 to 2013. And during her tenure, she managed a budget and operations of a 650-person litigation division and oversaw a nationwide docket of approximately 7,000 cases. Before her appointment as Assistant Attorney General, she was counsel for the corporate and environmental programs at General Electric Company, and she also has more than a decade of experience in private practice, having previously practiced at 2 prominent Washington, D.C. law firms, including as a partner. Peter Lehner is a senior attorney at Earthjustice. He directs Earthjustice's Sustainable Food and Agriculture program, developing strategies to reduce health, environmental, and climate harms from production of our food and to promote a more environmentally sound agricultural system. From 2007 to 2015, Peter was the executive director of the Natural Resources Defense Council and the NRDC Action Fund. There, Peter guided NRDC's policy, advocacy, communications, strategy, development, and management, and led the Action Fund's political activities. Among other new initiatives, Peter shaped a clean food program with food waste, antibiotic-free meat, and climate mitigation projects. From 1999 to 2006, Peter served as chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. He supervised all environmental litigation by and against the state, prosecuting a wide variety of polluters and developing innovative multi-state strategies targeting global warming and air pollution emissions from the nation's largest electric utilities. Previously, Peter served at NRDC for 5 years, directing the Clean Water Program, where he brought important attention to stormwater pollution. And last but not least, Mike LeVine, is the Pacific Senior Counsel at Oceana. Mike has more than a decade of experience living in Alaska and working to ensure that good decisions are made about our ocean resources. He provides legal expertise and guidance for Oceana on issues in Alaska and along the Pacific coast, including oil and gas activities, industrial fishing, and ocean acidification. As part of this work, he tries to bridge the gap between science, law, and policy in an effort to bring comprehensive science-based management and stewardship to decisions about the Pacific and Arctic marine resources. He has particular expertise in offshore oil and gas regulation and management, as well as the impacts of large-scale commercial fishing on threatened and endangered species. Prior to joining Oceana, Michael worked for the Juneau Office of Earthjustice, where he represented conservation organizations, Alaska Native entities, and communities on issues related to on and offshore oil leasing and exploration, fisheries, and forest management. So I would like to start with David Hayes and his remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Jayni. I have a few slides. I don't know if there's a clicker, or should I go up there?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I'll go up there. Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah. First, I want to thank all of you for being here, but mostly thank Trevor and Ricky for sponsoring this. The Institute here does amazing work. I've had the pleasure of working with Jayni on coal reform activities, and my congratulations to NYU's public spiritedness. You're going to be needed all the more now in the time ahead. I was actually have mixed emotions about being here. I was slated to help lead the transition in this arena, and had canceled out, but here I am. So I do want to talk about the future, if you will, and try to crystal ball things a little bit. I thought the way I would do it is to address natural resources writ large first, and let me say that one good thing that's occurred in the last few years from my perspective is that the natural resources side of the environmental field has moved from the backwater to the front row. I grew up initially as an EPA-oriented regulatory environmental lawyer. I thought that's what the environment was all about, and it certainly is an important aspect of it. But when I left my law firm to join Bruce Babbitt in the Interior Department in 1997, people thought I had lost my mind. Wasn't I interested in environmental issues? I discovered there that our landscapes, our water resources, our energy resources are all about the environment. And that reality has only been re-emphasized in the years since then. So I want to start by talking about why it is that natural resources has become so important in the environmental field, and then talk about each of the factors and how they might play out given the seismic activities that occurred last week. Is there a slide up that shows a little diagram? No? All right, let's try this. Okay. Pardon? One more. All right. Thank you. I'm going to need your help throughout this 15 minutes, obviously. So, three principal reasons why the light bulb has gone off about the relevance and indeed arguably the centrality of natural resources policy in dealing with the most pressing environmental issues of our day. The three reasons are, first, the energy sector has become one of our economy's most important sectors, and energy policy and natural resources policy are inextricably intertwined, as I'll talk about more in a minute. I'm just doing the setup here. Secondly, climate change concerns have been ascendant in recent years, and climate change policy and natural resources policy are inextricably intertwined for reasons I'll talk about. And thirdly, there's an emerging appreciation for the economic significance of our natural resources, including in particular, we've always known about the extractive industries side of the natural resources economy, but in recent years, we've learned more about the positive economics associated with effective stewardship of our natural resources, as opposed to their short-term exploitation. So let's look at each of these factors, and I'm going to talk about the trend lines that we see in each of these arenas, and spotlight some concerns about whether those trend lines will continue, will stall out, whether there'll be a step back or what. Nobody knows, but I just want to set the table here. So first, the first factor, again, is the economic importance of energy and its relation to natural resources. So how's it become so intertwined? Well, what's happened, obviously, in our country is a renaissance of natural gas. 10 years ago, natural gas was not a significant factor in our economy. We were preparing to build LNG facilities to import natural gas, but then fracking and new technology developed, and we've had an explosion of domestic natural gas. Natural gas is a natural resource. Natural gas to be developed requires siting and impacts on other resources, as we'll talk about. Also, we've had an explosion of interest in renewable energy. When the Obama administration came in January 2009, we had no utility-scale solar projects on our public lands, period. I'm not sure we had any anywhere, actually. Now we have 20,000 new megawatts of permitted projects on our public lands. Phenomenal change. And to make the point further, energy is sourced from natural resources feedstocks. You see, obviously, oil, which also has the domestic production of oil has increased greatly because of fracking. Natural gas is now 28% of our overall energy consumption and rising. Coal is declining, but also obviously creates enormous natural resources issues, and renewable energy is increasing. So what are the major trend lines in this intersection between energy policy and natural resources? I identify a couple. One is, I would argue, that there's been an appreciation for the environmental risks associated with domestic energy production and a willingness to address those risks through common sense regulatory responses. That's my proposition. Let's talk about offshore, for example. Offshore oil and gas development in the Gulf of Mexico increased enormously in recent years as deep water technology enabled drilling to occur at deeper and deeper depths. The oil spill occurred. We recognized as a country that we were not regulating that industry adequately, and so common sense regulatory requirements came into play on an emergency basis and continue today with a pending rule that will deal with well control requirements for deep water drilling if it becomes finalized by the Trump administration. We've also seen the risks of offshore drilling in the Arctic. We have seen the East Coast governors and decide not to go forward with offshore drilling off the Atlantic. At least that's the preliminary indication, and we will find out whether that survives. We've seen shale gas, obviously, development explode, and we've seen some common sense regulatory responses to that. On public lands, which are a relatively small percentage of the fracking lands, probably 20% of our fracked natural gas and oil comes from our public lands, we have a BLM rule that has common sense environmental requirements, including with a special focus on well integrity and also on appropriate handling of development water. And actually, the water issues associated with fracking are some of the most significant environmental risks associated with it. We have learned in recent years that our domestic oil and gas production presents serious methane release issues, and we have been responding with what I would argue are common sense regulatory responses to that. The Department of the Interior is releasing, I think today, or was it yesterday, the final venting and flaring rules for that essentially prohibit the waste of natural gas through venting on public lands. We have a number of states that have regulated methane. We have EPA that has stepped into venting and flaring on an initial basis for new sources. We've also seen seismic issues, and some states are starting to deal with that. Coal mining, mountaintop mining, obviously has tremendous environmental impact, and we have the Obama administration dealing with that through a very long regulatory process leading to the Stream Protection Rule, whose final environmental impact statement will be coming out, I believe, this week, and a final rule likely in the next month or so. Other coal mining issues have arisen, and with the help of NYU and others, issues such as reform of the leasing approach, and also, again, common sense environmental regulations and rejiggering, like addressing the bonding requirements to ensure that as coal companies lose their financial ability, they still have the wherewithal to address the environmental impact that they leave behind. All of that is in the works. On renewable energy, there are environmental impacts there as well, obviously, with wildlife issues for wind being prominent, also for solar and the desert projects and their impacts on wildlife. And then both conventional and renewable energy have been dealing with a lot of siting issues that are real environmental issues. Are we going to protect our sensitive lands? Are we going to drill or site renewable energy projects in the right way and in the right places? And there's been a lot of trends going on there, I think good trends toward landscape level planning, to provide a pre-evaluation of the places that make the most sense for drilling or for renewable energy projects, leading to the solar energy zones that have been created in the Southwest, the master leasing plans that BLM has been developing for future oil and gas production, trends to require energy developers to mitigate for the unavoidable impacts associated with their developments, and set-asides of particularly sensitive lands, with the national monuments obviously being the most prominent, but also with BLM doing a lot of identification of sensitive lands and saying no to development in those areas. Another trend line in this arena on the public lands has been interest in obtaining appropriate compensation for private energy development on the lands that all of us as Americans own in common. There's been a fair return movement, a concern about the giveaway of coal resources for below market prices. The Obama administration has put a moratorium in place on new leasing until there's a comprehensive programmatic environmental impact statement that has been completed. There is talk of royalty reform and the need to raise royalties to, among other things, arguably take into account the climate impacts of coal. Recently, last week, BLM came out with their new competitive leases in the renewable energy space to help ensure that there's a fair return for renewable energy development on public lands. And a lot of interest and early thinking about requiring compensation for the climate impacts associated with fossil fuel development on our public lands, including potential ideas ranging from keep it in the ground to a budget for carbon associated with development of fossil fuels from public lands. So these are the trend lines in this very important first area. And don't worry, Jayni, I'm not going to talk this much about all these areas. What about the Trump campaign? What do we know from the rhetoric and the positions of Donald Trump, how the next administration will deal with these trend lines? Well, it seems to be arguably a null set between the trend lines I talked about and some of the Trump campaign promises and their rhetoric. There has been a vigorous emphasis on coal and oil and gas development throughout this country, including on the public lands. We're back to drill, baby, drill. And there's an antipathy to regulations, period, it seems. This is the unanswered question. I identified a number of areas where I would say there's common sense regulatory responses to what has been a burgeoning, new, and generally positive domestic energy renaissance. Query whether those regulations are going to go by the board because of the overall skepticism of environmental rules in general. And there seems to be an antipathy about non-fossil fuels, renewable energy, and sort of loosely stated concerns about that. And I suspect on the fair return issue and the question of compensation for climate impacts, we're not going to see much progress. So let me move from energy now to climate change. And the next slide is the one that shows the carbon dioxide emissions. Right. So climate change and energy are intertwined, and natural resources are now intertwined in a dramatic way because most of the greenhouse gases in the world and in the US are associated with energy development. And interestingly, globally, 25% of the global emissions, somewhat less in the US, are associated with other land use, natural resource issues, in particular deforestation and agricultural related emissions. So when you add it together, you add the energy sector plus other land use emissions sources, you are talking about the natural resource world as arguably the primary focal point for climate change. So what are the trend lines here in terms of climate change and natural resources? Well, this is where the trend lines are developing, but are not nearly as mature as they were in the first segment that I talked about. There's certainly a recognition that in terms of the generation of energy, that there should be some accounting for climate change impacts. I mentioned the fair share point and the idea of potentially increasing royalties to take into account the climate impacts and costs that are associated with coal production, for example, but which are now unreimbursed. There's also an interest in obviously modernizing federal requirements to account for climate impacts. And on the impact side of the equation, again, natural resources are on the front lines. It's the coasts that are taking the brunt, obviously, of sea rise and storm surge. Drought, flooding, severe storm events are affecting our natural resources, our landscapes, our agricultural sector, every sector, wildlife, invasive species, tree death, forest health, all being affected in a big way. These are core natural resources, so climate needs to be in the midst of this. And also not to be lost is the fact that natural resource landscapes have a real positive impact in the climate cycle. Healthy forests drink in a huge amount of carbon. All our landscapes do, to the extent that that's why deforestation is such an issue globally, because we lose that benefit. There's a lot of talk now about the potential to actually enhance the benefit there. So you compare that to, do we have that unrecognizable diagram that you can't read? Is that what's up there now? Good, perfect. So what does the Trump campaign say about this? Well, skepticism about whether climate change is really an issue. No impetus in dealing with climate effects, and presumably a stalling out of the policy issues in climate change and natural resources, from fair share to floodplain insurance to infrastructure siting, coastal impacts, et cetera. Okay, the third big factor is the eco-economy, and this is the third big issue here I see for natural resources, which is, and trend line, an increased recognition that the wise management of our natural resources delivers both direct and indirect economic benefits that traditionally have been understated and underappreciated. I hate the term ecosystem services, but that's part of what we're talking about here, which is healthy forests provide clean water to cities. Good agriculture can provide tremendous environmental benefits to landscapes, maintain open space, maintain the carbon absorption capacity of landscapes. Wetlands have an outsized role in terms of absorbing carbon dioxide. And the outdoor economy, do we have the outdoor economy slide up there? Yes, oh, right. Only two more after this, Jayni. The outdoor economy had never been calculated before. When we came in 2009, Ken Salazar said, well, what's the Park Service? What's the outdoor economy? How much is, no one had ever looked at that. The Outdoor Industry Alliance got swung into action with the economists from the Interior Department and others, and guess what they came up with? Over $650 billion a year, more than 6 million jobs a year are associated with the outdoor economy. So there we have another big trend line, a recognition that actually protecting our resources, our landscapes, has economic benefits just by being there and being sitting in in their beautiful bounty. So now to sum up, where are my biggest concerns about the next administration's interplay with these trends? And finally, are there any bright spots? Biggest concerns. First is the public lands are central to many of these natural resources issues. 1/3 the landmass of the United States is owned by you and me. And those public lands can be managed thoughtfully and with the long term in mind. And the Republican platform says that states should have the right to take those lands from the federal government if they want to. If that happens, many of the sensible regulatory requirements and sensible long-term management issues are in danger. When you have folks like the Bundys rising up and potentially fueled by a Trump administration, this is a real danger. Secondly, will we protect America's special places? The Antiquities Act, is that now a danger area? The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which has been protected for years now, but with hand-to-hand combat in the past, are we going there again? Offshore drilling, have we learned the lessons of the Deepwater Horizon and the harshness of the Arctic? Will we go back after the failures in the summer of 2010 and 2012? Or was it 2012 and 2013? I don't know. Are we going to develop the Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay? Are we going to respect tribal interests on our landscapes? Third, are we going to roll back common sense environmental protections? The offshore drilling requirements I referenced, the federal fracking rule, which has been stayed, in which there's an oral argument on January 17th about, the venting and flaring rule, the stream protection rule. Fourth, are we going to weight federal policy toward fossil fuels and away from clean energy? What's going to be the fate of that coal programmatic environmental impact statement? Are siting protections and these reforms about landscape level planning going out the window? And will the limited federal resources be skewed toward fossil fuels again? Fifth, are we going to ignore climate change and its impacts? Are we going to suppress information about what's happening? Are we going to stop protecting our forest rangelands and coastlines? All right, potential opportunities. Is there a bright side? We have to hope. I'll mention three things quickly. Infrastructure seems to be an area of interest by the Trump administration, as it should be. Will we invest in climate resilient infrastructure? Will we take into account the risky business report of Mayor Bloomberg and Tom Steyer and Hank Paulson? Will we use money wisely to improve our water infrastructure and protect clean water supply? Will we help with clean energy and spend money on transmission needed to unlock important clean energy resources? Number two, will we celebrate public lands and make sensible decisions? There's a lot of folks out on the landscape, red-ribbed, whatever I'm trying to say, Republicans who are interested in this issue, the ranchers who were in favor of the Crown of the Continent protections and the Everglades Headwaters National Wildlife Refuge. Are we increasing access to hunting and fishing? This is not a partisan issue. Let's make sure that we work together on this. And thirdly, and finally, will we protect our wildlife? And I end, is it all blue now? With the U.S. Wildlife Trafficking Alliance. This is my own personal hobby horse. Our global problems of killing the elephants and rhinos that are facing extinction. Will we work together on that while we also continue to protect the sage grouse? Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to ask Mike to go next.
Thanks, thanks, Jayni, and I'm going to stand up so that I can see this side of the room and maybe see my slides here. So I wanted to start by thanking you, Jayni, for having me. And thanks for collaborating with Oceana on offshore oil and gas issues over the last several years. I'm both honored and honestly a bit humbled to share the stage with David, Ignacia, and Peter. And David has done a great job of setting the stage for what I hope to talk about, which is to dig a little more specifically into some of the issues that David referenced. And I'll start just by way of background for anyone who doesn't know what Oceana is. We are an international nonprofit organization dedicated to maintaining and restoring ocean resources. And we think of the work we do as operating through this triangle of law, science, and policy to affect in-the-water change in the areas of habitat conservation, fisheries, pollution. And we're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have offices around the world. All of our West Coast work is headquartered in Juneau, Alaska, which is where I'm based. I'm going to talk a little bit, just as an example, of one of the large marine ecosystems we work on and how we approach the issues. So I focus a lot on the Arctic, the Chukchi-Beaufort Sea, down to the Bering and Aleutian Islands. And this is a region that we know is changing rapidly. It's one of the places climate change is having the most significant impacts. And we know now that we have intact ocean ecosystems, healthy populations of marine mammals, and coastal communities that depend on those ocean resources. We know they're changing, and we know that the choices we're making about industrial activities, offshore oil and gas, shipping, fishing, are going to affect what the region looks like in 10, 20, 50, or 100 years. And so one of the things that we focus a lot of energy and time on is bringing good information to bear on those decisions and trying to push for planning and science so that we have a vision for what the region's going to look like in 50 or 100 years, and we're making choices that are consistent with that vision. And we've made a lot of progress in that over the last 8 years, and quite frankly, David was at the forefront of a lot of that planning and a lot of that effort for the Arctic region. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the good steps that have been made toward getting good science in the Arctic and good planning. But as I was thinking about this talk and thinking about all the accomplishments that had been made over the last 8 years and thinking forward, this is what came to mind. I mean, planning and science, not a hallmark of the Donald Trump campaign, right? And incidentally, when I pulled this up on the internet, this came up, and so I was reminded that the first picture, of course, from Home Alone 1, Donald Trump was an extra in Home Alone 2, and so there he is. But to go back to this, just for a minute, especially for a place like the Arctic, where we're needing forward-looking planning and holistic vision, there are a lot of steps that have been made by this administration that are very significantly at risk. And so I would just begin by thinking about what could a Trump administration do. So this excerpt is from a 2002 New York Times editorial talking about what the Bush administration did in its first couple of years, taking us out of the Kyoto Protocol, for example. That's something that we might expect the Trump administration to do. David talked some about regulatory rollbacks, and I'll talk about some specific things that are at issue in that regard. And note that at least 2 years in, there was hope in the Bush administration for additional rollbacks. One area on which Oceana works, and David talked a little bit about this, is offshore oil and gas issues. So right now, the Obama administration is finalizing the 2017 to 2022 5-year program. The way the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act works, planning takes place in 5-year stages. Incidentally, it was originally on 0 and 5s, but some litigation in the early 80s made it to 2s and 7s, and it's been 2s and 7s ever since. And the administration has been preparing this program, which sets out a schedule for lease sales for the coming 5 years over the last couple of years. The plan, when it was originally conceived 2 years ago, included sales in the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic coast, and in the Arctic. Over about a year ago, the administration announced that it was removing the Atlantic planning areas from the program, and the final decision we expect to come in the next few days will certainly have sales in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's a question about whether there will be sales scheduled in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas in the Arctic. And I can tell you that going back to the first plan in 1980, every single 5-year program prepared since has had sales in the Arctic Ocean. There have been 2 big boom and bust cycles of companies spending billions of dollars to purchase leases and conduct exploration, only to walk away from those investments. So this map shows you the leases that were purchased in the Chukchi Sea in 2008, 487 leases at a cost of more than $2 billion. Shell pushed really hard to drill exploration wells, and what you see on the bottom is the one lease that's left. So companies have largely walked away from this investment, and we have been we have been and are hopeful that the Obama administration will chart a new course in the Arctic and not schedule new sales for the coming 5 years, and instead let us focus on good decisions for the region. If that happens, and honestly, even if it doesn't, the 5-year program is something that's very much at risk in the next administration. There's nothing in the law that would prevent a Trump administration from revisiting this plan. We, of course, think there's no really good reason to sell leases in the Atlantic or the Arctic. The downturn in the economy and hopefully a focus on more sustainable energy resources should lead to leases not being included, and perhaps this wouldn't be a target, but it's certainly something that's at risk. Something else at risk, and something very familiar, David, I'm showing a slide here that has the Managing for a Future in a Rapidly Changing Arctic publication. This administration and this Department of the Interior have focused very concretely on science in the Arctic. One of these publications is a map toward integrated Arctic management, and the other is a gap analysis showing what science we know about the Arctic and what we don't. And these have been hallmarks of this administration's path forward. Perhaps there'll be hallmarks of a Trump administration, although it's hard to see from the campaign rhetoric how that would be consistent with his approach. Then there are a variety of other initiatives that this administration has put in place that are really important. One is the focus on open government. I am a firm believer that open government, transparent government is good government. The Obama administration has focused very concretely on its open government initiative, and this has had an effect in natural resources management. The Department of the Interior is joining an international initiative called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which requires disclosure of revenue that's received from fossil fuels. This has the possibility of divulging lots of really important information about how we as the American public get fair value for our resources. That's something that requires funding and leadership at the Department of the Interior. President Obama established the National Ocean Council and a national ocean policy, something else that would be at risk in a Trump administration. And in June or July, final rules were promulgated for exploration in the Arctic Ocean. They require common sense precautions, and they also would be at risk. So I went through all of that, and that was enough to make me really depressed. And the other day in the hotel, I was watching a documentary about the 1983 North Carolina Wolfpack National Championship run, which if you haven't seen, you should totally see. And this is Jim Valvano, the coach of that national championship run. He has passed away from cancer, and he said this: "Don't give up, don't ever give up," in one of the famous speeches he gave right before he passed away. So I thought, well, okay, it can't be that dire. There's got to be things we can think about, ways to look forward. So there are, in fact. And the first is to say that not everything an incoming administration wants to do is it going to get done, right? The Bush administration never succeeded in undermining the National Environmental Policy Act. The roadless rule was promulgated in the waning days of the Clinton administration, and the Bush administration tried to roll it back. And nearly 16 years later, after a variety of different lawsuits, that rule has withstood both the Bush administration rollback and challenges from states and industry, and there's no logging in inventory roadless areas. Similarly, in 2007, the Ninth Circuit stopped Shell from drilling in the Beaufort Sea, and it took them 10 more years to get up there and complete a single exploration well. So there is hope that all of the things that get laid out in an agenda won't come to pass. There's also, opportunity, we hope, to collaborate with an administration. So the Arctic Fishery Management Plan is a plan for the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. It closes nearly 200,000 square miles of our federal waters to commercial fishing until there's sufficient information to ensure that those fisheries can be managed sustainably. The program was developed during the Bush administration. The regulations implementing it were finalized in the National Marine Fisheries Service during the Bush administration, and it grew in part from a resolution in the Senate that was introduced by Republican Senator Stevens, went all the way through the Senate, went through the House, and it was signed by George Bush calling for conservation of straddling stocks of fish in the Arctic. So perhaps there's opportunity in some regard to work with an incoming administration. Also, go back. There we go. There are some things that may not change. So this is an excerpt from our National Arctic Strategy, which the Bush administration finalized in 2009. It revised a strategy that was put in place in 1994 by the Clinton administration, and it stayed in place through the Obama administration. It has guided Arctic policy. All the good things we saw in the last 8 years have been guided by this same document. The Obama administration promulgated an implementation plan for this, but maybe there are some things that will survive and will continue to guide governance in the next 4 years. And then also, and I think Ricky touched on this in his introduction, one of the things that's likely to happen in an unfavorable administration for environmental issues is that people will go look to other venues. During the Bush administration, the refusal to address climate issues led to states implementing their own climate rules. And so for those of us who intend to continue to work forward on environmental issues over the next 4 years, it's probably time to look for different decision makers, be it states, companies, marketplace, and think creatively about different ways to achieve conservation. And I'm going to leave you on that hopeful note with just another caption from a movie, not a Macaulay Culkin picture, but another image from one of my favorite movies. And if we're going to think forward about achieving conservation, we have to maintain hope and optimism, and that's where I'd like to leave the presentation.
Thank you, Mike and Peter.
Okay, I'm going to also stand up here so I can see the slides, and I'll echo Mike saying it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with this panel and give us all a chance to think about moving ahead. I will just say that I was at the New York Attorney General's office during the Bush years. We were pretty busy, but I say that because, in fact, the interplay of states and the federal government was made real to me. I learned about federalism in law school, but then I was living federalism. And I think we're going to see a lot of important action by the states. We were very successful in pushing back against a number of what turned out, what courts held to be illegal Bush administration attempts to roll back environmental protections. So we can expect to see some of that moving forward. I'm going to be speaking about agriculture, which is to some extent a bit new for me and probably for many of you. I spent 3 decades working in general environmental law, and over the years, more and more seeing the impacts of agriculture and our food system on our health, our environment, and our climate, and yet recognizing that there was really remarkably little attention being directed to agriculture and the food system by, among others, the big NGOs. So I decided that that's where I would try to spend a lot more time. And I think it's been a fascinating journey as I've been learning more about it, and I hope that today might be just a first step for many of you on a journey to think about agriculture a bit more. And there we go. One is, this is a panel on natural resources, and you really can't think about natural resources without thinking about agriculture. 61% of the continental U.S. is engaged in agriculture. In either cropland or grazing land. Agriculture uses 80% of our water. It's, among other things, also a main driver of our chemical use, and it is what dominates our natural resources. Fly from here to anywhere and look out the window, and what do you see? You see agriculture. But in addition to affecting natural resources, it has a tremendous impact on our health. And you can't think about agriculture, which is meant to produce food, without thinking about the food system. And what are we producing in our food system? Well, right now, it's a lot of crap. The average American eats a diet of 3 burgers and more than 3 liters of soda a week. We spend $1.5 trillion on the food we buy every year, but only about 10% of that gets to the farmers. And what's the impact of that? Diet-related diseases are now, right now, exceeding smoking-related diseases in the U.S. and worldwide, costing, according to Credit Suisse and others, over $1 trillion of healthcare costs every year. If one really wanted to reduce healthcare costs that people complain about under the Affordable Care Act, one would start with addressing our diet. Whether President Trump will do that, who knows? Early indications are that he's not been a fan of what he views as Michelle Obama's healthy food efforts, but that would definitely be a place to address our healthcare system. In addition, our food system right now, because of the way it has become more industrialized, has a tremendous impact on property values, on farm workers, on properties near farms. And yet, despite all of this, and despite the amount of money that we pour into the farm system, the farmers themselves are actually not doing all that great. Most of them report losses, and as you see, the vast majority have to get the bulk of their income from non-farm sources to supplement a very meager farm income. And then there's the environmental costs of the food system. It is the main driver of water pollution. It is obviously the source of a tremendous amount of chemical pollution through pesticide use. The nitrogen pollution think of the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and the Chesapeake Bay, in virtually every estuary, that's agricultural runoff. And it just goes on and on. But one thing that we rarely think about is the climate harms of agriculture. When we do think about agriculture, we think about perhaps the impact of climate on agriculture. It will make growing our food a little more challenging. The Paris Agreement, let's hope that it continues in full force, barely mentions food and agriculture. It talks only about food security and not the impact of agriculture as a contributor to climate change. And yet it's really pretty significant. You have the actual on-farm emissions from agriculture. A lot of it is from animal agriculture, as I'll go into detail in a second, but also crop production. But when you add to the other elements of the food system, the production of fertilizer, very high energy, high polluting process. You add the on-farm energy usage and the production of the processing of food going into the use of the food, because after all, you have to do some processing or cooking of it. And then when we throw it out in the landfills, where organic matter is the largest component of municipal landfills, you end up getting a much bigger footprint from the food system, overall about 18 or more % of the U.S. agriculture, of the U.S. greenhouse gas footprint. It's actually bigger in many other countries because the power and transportation sectors are smaller, and because deforestation in many countries, which is a real driver of climate impacts, is also more significant there than here. But in the U.S., it's still quite significant. It's a little different than we think of, by and large, when we think about climate change. We think about fossil fuels. You burn coal, you burn gas, you emit CO2, you get climate change. With agriculture, it's quite different than that. The predominant emissions are of methane, which comes from cows and cow waste. Interestingly, the amount of methane that comes from cows, basically, is about the same as the amount of methane that comes from the oil and gas sector. And as many of you know, David talked about the Obama administration's effort to put limits on methane from the oil and gas sector, but there are no limits on methane from the agricultural sector. And so one of the interesting dynamics we'll see with agriculture, as I'll mention again in a bit, there's so many fewer rules, there's less to roll back. By and large, the approach to agriculture has not been a regulatory approach, even though agriculture today has become really as industrial an activity as the other industries that are regulated. The other main greenhouse gas from agriculture is nitrous oxide, which comes largely from the operation of fertilizer that isn't taken up by the plants. Nitrogen fertilizer is important for plant growth, but we tend to apply vastly more than we need, on average about double the amount of fertilizer we need. And that fertilizer goes somewhere. It either goes out in the rivers and contaminates drinking water supplies, like in the city of Des Moines, which is now suing upstate farm regions because they are having to spend more money to keep their drinking water clean because of nitrate pollution, or through microbial action, it goes into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas as well as a potent ozone depleter. There is some carbon dioxide from all the on-farm energy use and their processing of it, through the processing system and transportation. It's about at 1.5% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So what are we going to do about all of this? The good news, I suppose, is that many of the practices that can be done on farms that can reduce the climate impacts will also significantly reduce other environmental impacts. So if you're more concerned about clean air and clean water in your community, those same practices can make a difference even if you're not concerned about climate change. And in addition, many of these same practices can make your farm more resilient to climate change by making your farm more resilient to droughts, to floods, as well as, frankly, to, for example, increase fertilizer costs because you have a healthier soil, so you don't need as much fertilizer. And lastly, many of these approaches can, at least over the longer run, actually save the farmers money. But so much of the farm system is torqued through a very heavily subsidized system that the economic driver is sometimes camouflaged by federal policies. And I won't go into this in detail here, but there are some amazing things that can be done. And there's work being done by USDA to encourage, through their climate hubs, consideration of these practices, such as applying just the right amount of fertilizer. Your plants still get all they need, but less runs off into the water and less goes out into the atmosphere. Changing cropping systems, using cover crops which protect your soil during the off-season, but also can inject nutrients into the soil. Crop rotations, which can have tremendous advantages for creating healthier soil. If you look at pictures of different grazing systems, you'll see some where the grazing has destroyed and denuded the landscape. All that's left are some invasive species and some eroding dirt, and other grazing systems where you still have lush grasslands that can support a range of wildlife. Different grazing systems can make a tremendous amount of difference, as well as how we manage the manure from our industrial meat system. It is important to know that even though you might hear about grass-fed beef and all those nice things, still well over 95% of the meat comes from industrial operations, which bear much closer resemblance to a refinery or a factory of some sort than anything close to a prototypical farm. But I'll leave you with two parting thoughts to think about in terms of federal policy moving ahead, because as I said, there's not so much to roll back. In this area, it's largely been an area where there has not been many mandates upon farmers. Despite some of the rhetoric, there's been a lot. One of President-elect Trump's targets is the Waters of the U.S. rule, which the Farm Bureau has said is just crushing American agriculture, even though, as many of you know, would only restore some but not all of the scope of the original Clean Water Act protections. And most of the approach has been through encouraging farmers to do environmentally preferable behavior through payments. Those come from the federal government through the states. The states have a lot of say over how that money is spent, and I think there will be the opportunity to shape some of those payments a little more, and whether or not that will happen or not, we'll have to see. But there is something arguably quite sensible. If the federal government or the American taxpayer is paying you, it's not unreasonable to ask the recipient of that money not to be polluting their neighbor, destroying our patrimony of healthy soil, and thinking about the future of the country. But two thoughts, as I said, it's not just how we grow our food, it's what food we grow. And this is sort of an extraordinary graph if you look at it. The black line in the middle, that you see there, is this is a global calculator of greenhouse gas emissions of the whole world, looking at different scenarios. Black is sort of business as usual. It's not a very good scenario for climate stability, well over 2 degrees centigrade. If we, as the other hand, as a planet, decided, look, we really can't eat so much meat because meat has such an enormous climate footprint, and did nothing else so we weren't very successful in moving towards renewable energy and efficiency and all the rest of that, but just had a low meat scenario, you get way down there and almost get yourself to within the comfort range of a 2 degrees centigrade target. If, on the other hand, we go where projections have to the rest of the world eating the amount of meat, say, just even Europe eats, which is much less than the average American eats, that's the line that goes off the chart, and looking at 6-10 degrees centigrade change. And this is sort of the disturbing part, this, I guess it's the blue line there, that is the line where if the world goes to a European diet and does all this other stuff as aggressively as we can in terms of clean energy and efficiency, renewable energy, and all the rest of that. If we do all of that and still don't address what food we are growing, the planet is cooked. So that's one thought. But it also means things are in our own hands because we make dietary choices, of course, every day. The last point is nowadays you've been hearing a lot of talk about food waste. I hope you've been hearing a lot of talk about food waste, recognizing that we waste, in some sense, 40% of what comes into the system is thrown out. About half of that from our homes and half from stores and restaurants. But if we think a little bit about the energy system and realize that there are a lot of ways of energy waste besides air conditioning a room with windows open, an incandescent light bulb, a gas bulb, these are all forms of energy waste because they're inefficient. Well, if you think that way, there's actually a lot of waste throughout our food and agriculture system. Right now, we've got 30 or 40 million acres of corn being grown for biofuels to create corn-based ethanol, which we now understand to be actually negative from a climate perspective. So why are we using all this valuable farmland to go backwards on climate? We have an area about the size of New Jersey that is growing either sugar or high fructose corn syrup that goes into products that are nutritionally negative. Food is supposed to nourish us and be a source of food, of health. If this is taking us backwards, why are we using all that land to grow stuff that's bad for us? And then finally, we have, again, 30 or 40 million acres of crops being grown for animal feed, where it takes about 12 to 14 pounds of grain to get a pound of meat, and more inefficient than the incandescent light bulb. So if we start thinking about the food system really that way, again, what we are growing, not just how we're growing, we're seeing a lot of opportunities. Whether or not Donald Trump's populism and his efforts at controlling waste and cutting back on the federal government will actually address any of these forms of waste, of course, we'll have to see. But I think it is worth thinking about the opportunities to reform the food system throughout and not just at the simple level of how do we grow our food. Let's think about what we're doing with our land. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. And last but not least, Ignacia.
Good morning. I'm delighted to participate on this distinguished panel. I hope you can hear me. I'm fighting a cold, so I will do my best. But want to start by thanking Jayni and Ricky for inviting me to weigh in on this important discussion that we're having today. And also wanted to thank Ricky for his leadership in founding Institute for Policy Integrity with others, and for all the great work that has been done in recent years, and that's going to continue to be done. I think that the work is more critical than ever. And in full disclosure, I'm a member of the advisory board of the Institute for Policy Integrity, and I'm a very big fan. So, as you've just heard from my fellow panelists, there are many important natural resource policy issues that continue to need our dedicated attention before the end of the Obama administration and going forward. As part of this panel, I've been asked in general to address some of the opportunities and constraints that are built into the system during a presidential transition. In preparing my remarks, I reviewed materials presented by the Partnership for Public Services Center for Presidential Transition, executive orders, statutory provisions, MOUs, congressional research reports, White House memorandum, among other things. And I spoke with a number of career and political agency staff. I've also lived through 2 transitions as a member of the outgoing Clinton administration in the year 2000, and as a member of the incoming Obama administration in 2009. Now, this doesn't mean that I know a single thing about what is going on in the Trump transition, other than that the campaign is over and it is time to prepare the president-elect and his team to govern. And that's a very important thing, I think, for us to consider. So what more can the Obama administration do in the period remaining before the inauguration of the president-elect? That's a question that I think some of the other panelists also have posed and addressed. And what can the incoming administration do in the period immediately after the president-elect is sworn in to change course on policy, rules, and litigation that are not aligned with its own priorities? But before we get to that, I'd like to address some bedrock principles. First and foremost, a fundamental goal of the transition process is to ensure that the incoming administration is ready to govern the first day in office. The hum of government will not stop while the incoming administration comes up to speed. Members of the new administration will have to make immediate decisions on a vast array of nationally significant issues across as many as 100 federal agencies. Therefore, steps are taken early in an election year to ensure the continuity of government and the protection of the national interest, especially when the transfer of power from an outgoing president is to an incoming president of a different party. The goal is a smooth transfer of knowledge and power from one administration to the other, while which the Partnership for Public Services Center for Presidential Transition describes, and I'm going to quote, as a national security imperative and a solemn duty to the American people. Cooperation, transparency, and respect for the institutions of government and the professional executive career staff who play an important role in the transition are hallmarks of a successful transition, such as the ones from Bush to Clinton, Clinton to Bush, Bush to Obama, and as expected, Obama to Trump. President Obama said yesterday that ensuring a smooth transition is, quote, one of those norms that are vital to a functioning democracy. So the transition process begins well before Election Day and continues post-election to Inauguration Day. The focus is not on the nitty-gritty, but on the immediate major policy calls that must be made by the incoming administration when it takes office. The work to accomplish this is enormous, both for the outgoing and incoming administrations. As we speak, transition teams are conducting reviews at executive branch agencies to assess agency programs, policies, priorities, and significant or time-sensitive issues. You've heard some folks today discuss that there were key people here on the panel, for example, David, who had been tapped to head that process if Secretary Clinton had won the presidency. So without getting myself into too much of the nitty-gritty, there are different reviews that are held. Some are based on information that's just publicly available. Other reviews allow for the sharing of confidential information. And the bottom line is that there's an effort to make sure that the incoming president's team understands what is going on in the government now, what rules are pending, what policies are in the works, so that they can be ready to take action as soon as the president takes the oath of office. One thing that the review teams for the incoming Trump administration does not do is to participate in agency decision-making processes. They can get information, they are there observing. Some teams will get confidential information, but they do not get to tell the staff that is there now what to do or how to do it. As President Obama said also yesterday, there's only one president at a time. So the outgoing administration may continue to exercise its discretion and make policy, conduct litigation, and with some self-imposed limits, engage in rulemaking. So let me talk about rulemaking and so-called midnight regulations. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have sought to limit the so-called midnight regulations that are promulgated at the quote-unquote 11th hour before an administration leaves office. And the steps that have been taken include the following. In May 2008, Joshua Bolten, who was George W. Bush's chief of staff, advised agency heads that except in extraordinary circumstances, regulations were to be finalized in the Bush administration by November 1 and proposed no later than June 1st. In a similar vein, Howard Shalansky, the head of OIRA, which is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, advised deputy secretaries in this administration that to the extent feasible and consistent with their priorities, statutory obligations, and judicial deadlines, agencies should strive to complete their highest priority rulemakings by the summer of 2016 to avoid an end-of-year scramble. Now, according to OIRA Administrator Susan Dudley, efforts at controlling midnight regulations at the end of the Bush administration had mixed success. All told, OIRA completed a review of 100 final regulations between November 1, 2008 and January 20th, 2009. She believes that without the deadlines in the Bolton memo, that OIRA would have reviewed as many as hundreds more regulations in the post-election period. The Congressional Research Service did a study of these midnight regulations, and they concluded that the perception of midnight rulemaking as an unsavory practice is worse than the reality, because many of the so-called midnight rules, in fact, the ones they reviewed, were relatively routine, did not implicate new policy initiatives, and were the result of finishing work that was started before the presidential transition. I think we've heard on the panel about a lot of work that's in progress, some guidance, some programmatic EISs, some regulations. So it's going to be important for the people who are working on these different rulemakings, et cetera, to continue to press forward. So if it's not routine, when that is not the case, and it sometimes isn't the case, that an incoming administration has the prerogative to issue moratorium on rulemaking, postpone the effective date of pending rules, and as provided in the Administrative Procedure Act, take steps to amend or repeal final rules when it takes office. And this is a bipartisan precedent. For example, President Reagan issued a memo 9 days after his inauguration, which called for the postponement up to 60 days of the effective dates of final rules that were scheduled to take effect, but that had not yet taken effect. He also issued an executive order. The Clinton administration also had OMB Director Leon Panetta direct agency heads not to send proposed or final rules to the Federal Register withdraw all rules that had been sent but not yet published in the Federal Register, and as well as holding back and excluding certain rules that were subject to statutory and judicial deadlines. So the bottom line is that different administrations, including the Bush administration, the Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, also issued a directive. So an administration can come in and pull back rules that are not yet finalized, while it takes a look at the rules and reviews the rules. So we are in this period leading up to the transition of power, in which the administration can still act to finalize these rules, but they must get them through the whole process of publication in the Federal Register and, of course, effective date of rules. So the calendar is against us in many ways. Some things will get done nonetheless. So if a rule has gone through the whole process, certainly the incoming administration may wish to amend or repeal a final rule of the outgoing administration, but it's going to have to go through the notice and comment rulemaking process under the APA. For a change in a rule, the agency is going to have a rational basis for its decision as reflected in an administrative record, and it must be in accordance with the law. There is a lot of litigation that is possible on the horizon if there are any shortcuts that the incoming administration takes to roll back rules with which it doesn't agree. Congress also can take action, and as I'm presenting this to you, I'm thinking that I'm presenting all these dire scenarios, but I always think that it's good to know what the opportunities are currently to move forward on a policy agenda, and what the opportunities are to make sure that, to the extent that there are any attempted rollbacks, that there's also room there for challenges. But Congress can take action. And even if a regulation has taken effect, Congress can overturn or change a regulation or amend statutory authority underlying a regulation. Congress also has the power of the purse. The incoming Trump administration will get to decide and propose, well, they'll get to propose, not decide, the fiscal 2018 budget. That is for them to present. They can decide to defund certain programs. They can decide to fund programs or enforcement actions at lower levels than traditionally. Congress also may enact budget riders. We're all familiar with some of those, to defund certain agency programs or to undercut certain statutory requirements. And there will not be a president of a different party vetoing some of those attempts. So the other area that is something for us to think about and focus on is litigation. There's a lot of ongoing litigation. You've heard about some of the rules here from other panelists. And the question is going to be, what is going to happen in the context of ongoing litigation? When the Justice Department defends a rule, it presents itself on behalf of the United States. There is precedent. The Solicitor General has a role in deciding and approving what cases are appealed, and to some extent weighs in on what arguments to make. I can't imagine a circumstance where a Department of Justice lawyer, and I'll just speak for people in the Environment Division, would present himself or herself in court and say, oh, we changed our mind. It's not quite going to work like that. I can't imagine scenarios where there are cases that haven't been decided, where an agency may wish to take a remand of the rule. There might be a petition for reconsideration pending that might be granted. And if the agency takes back the rule before a decision is made, that's a different context and a different track. Certainly, litigation positions will be reviewed. There'll be the affirmative enforcement agenda versus all of the defensive cases that the United States engages in. So then what happens in these 100 days? We've heard that President-elect Trump wants to not be a signatory anymore of the Paris Agreement, withdraw from the Paris Accord, and possibly withdraw from the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Clean Power Plan. We have not heard a decision yet from the DC Circuit. It isn't clear if the court is going to rule before the new administration takes office. And what happens with all of those things, I'm going to leave to the next panel, which is going to talk about these issues. But there are a number of strategic issues that I know the administration is thinking about right now in terms of what work needs to get done and is going to get done. The president said they're hard at work and they're moving forward, but we also will have to keep our eye on what the new administration is going to do immediately in the first 100 days. I'm going to pause there, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so thank you so much to all of our panelists for their terrific remarks. We got started a little bit late, so I think we're going to go ahead and spend 10, 15 minutes here doing some questions. And I'll just start with the first question, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So I thought you all did a great job not only identifying some potential hurdles, but also giving us some reasons for hope. And I want to go back to that and ask if there are any other sort of traditional environmental advocacy, progressive type policies that you think have the potential to have traction in the new administration that you didn't mention previously. And specifically, David, when you were speaking, I was thinking about this fair share argument with respect to fossil fuels, which I think also, as Peter noted, applies to grazing, where oftentimes, these resources are given away at bargain basement prices. And we have a president who cares an awful lot about the art of the deal. And so I'm wondering, is that argument perhaps still viable, in a different way, focusing more on, it's a bad deal right now for the government, the way that we're selling these at such low prices. So that's just one example, but I was wondering if David and everyone else had more thoughts.
Sure, I'll take a crack at that. The fair share argument is compelling, and compelling across the spectrum to a lot of folks. Taxpayers for Common Sense, for example, has been a leading voice here in suggesting that for example, coal prices on federal lands are very depressed, and there have been very good economics studies backing that up. But it takes a lift to raise royalties. It takes a rulemaking process, and it will very much depend on the orientation of the appointees in the key agencies, whether they are more influenced by the call for more coal and oil and gas development, or the fair share argument. It shouldn't be an either or, but it may be. I'd also mention one other aspect that responds to your question about other hopeful constituencies that can help reinforce sound natural resource policy. And when I referred to it quickly about the public lands and the traditional stewardship interests of those who are living on our public lands. And the sportsman community also, the hunters and fishermen and recreational interests, et cetera. There's a long history of bipartisanship there. And so I think enlisting those constituencies provide hope that we will not throw out the baby with the bath.
Great.
I would just add, as I mentioned, in agriculture, there's a lot of subsidies that are encouraging behavior that doesn't make a lot of sense. And the renewable fuel standard is probably exhibit one. It would likely not exist were not for the legislation that requires it, probably also related to the fact that Iowa is the first caucus, which is why it's stuck around. But the crop insurance system right now, which on the one hand, of course, everyone would agree with a safety net. We have a lot of safety nets in our society, but the way it is now structured actually creates more incentives to grow the wrong stuff in the wrong places, which then incurs other costs. So I think, again, if there were an honest approach to, hey, how should we shrink the federal government and not spend money on arguably stupid things, there would be an opportunity to re-examine some of these programs to still provide a healthy environment, lots of good food, a safety net for farmers, but not encourage behavior that just digs it the hole deeper all the time.
Great. Michael.
I might just add briefly that in addition to fair share, and certainly in the realm of oil and gas, there are subsidies that companies get, which you would think would be a natural target for a Trump administration and even a Congress. But there's also another component to this in terms of looking at synergies between corporate interests and environmental interests, and especially in the realm of certainty. I mean, part of the reason the Arctic Fishery Management Plan was put in place is because the fishing interests wanted certainty in terms of structure. So there may be another aspect here in addition to fair share is a certainty.
Thank you all. Yes, so right here in the front.
Are we going to get really healthy food for lunch?
I don't know, but you will get lunch soon, and I think it will be relatively healthy. Yes. Just straight back there.
We know and are constantly made aware of the importance of the poles to the climate and to sea rise and all of that, and the country has profound strategic and scientific interest. Especially to Mr. LeVine, to what extent do you see the Arctic Council that we're part of as providing some boundary from which the incoming administration has to adhere to? And it also, by the way, obviously, requires our cooperation, which seems to be there with Russia.
Yeah, that's a good question. And for those unfamiliar with the Arctic Council, it's the 8 Arctic nations together working on issues in the Arctic. It's not a binding entity, and so nothing that comes from the Arctic Council is going to bind U.S. policy or U.S. choices. We are now the chair of the Arctic Council, and this administration has made a priority of participating and of leading the Arctic Council, especially in climate change efforts. It remains to be seen after the administration changes whether and how much a Trump administration invests in the Arctic Council, whether it maintains that role of leadership. We'll transfer the chairmanship in March to Finland. And so what we do and the manner in which the U.S. has demonstrated leadership, I mean, in addition to being part of the Arctic Council, there have been a bilateral agreement with Canada and a multilateral agreement with the Nordic nations, largely focused on the need for stewardship and management in the Arctic and climate change. I really don't have any idea what a Trump administration will do with those agreements, how it will perceive our role in the Arctic Council. The rhetoric, sort of isolationist rhetoric, doesn't make me hopeful, but the fact that this is a long-standing body and there's a clear need for multilateral management in the Arctic, maybe it's a place where there's opportunity to work forward.
Yeah, I'm going to go way back in the corner, the gentleman in the black shirt.
This is also a question for Mr. LeVine and for Ms. Moreno. And I'm focusing also on this idea of cabining natural resource policy discretion. So I wonder if there's a way to use climate projections to do that, and I wanted to get your thoughts. A few weeks ago, the Ninth Circuit published, I think, what is the third judicial decision upholding this administration's efforts to use IPCC climate projections on a 50-year basis and even on an 80-year basis to designate critical habitat and to list species as endangered based on the fact that they're going to lose their habitat. And I'm wondering, right now, that means we're at the situation where courts are saying it's not unreasonable for the government to look at long-term climate projections and make natural resource and endangered species policy decisions based on that. Do you see a litigation path forward to get from it's not unreasonable to look at climate change projections to it's incredibly unreasonable to ignore the climate change projections, and how would we get there?
That's a very good question, and one of the things that I've been thinking about is all of the work that the Obama administration did initially, including Administrator Lisa Jackson making the endangerment finding. There was an enormous, voluminous record, administrative record, with science, metrics for around the world. I mean, these are global experts speaking to this. And so the beauty of the administrative process is that you have to go, you can change your mind if you want, but you have to go back and show with facts and science data the basis for your decision-making. It's administrative process, administrative decision-making, and it has to be rational, and it has to be reasonable. And so, these are the sidebars that are going to be very, very important to a lot of these, changes in course that we might see, because the Supreme Court also has spoken on, the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases, and the endangerment finding has been upheld. So it's going to be interesting how the new administration coming in is going to try to manage against this backdrop of not only administrative law, but of all the findings that have been made. I don't think it's going to be as easy, but there are going to be policy approaches, and there are going to be different views, and we get to participate in the process to the extent that rules are going to be changed. If you had a final rule, and they have to go back through again, the administrative process to put a different proposal forward. And that is not a snap, easy thing to do. There are going to be some things that can be done immediately by executive order, right? There are a lot of, President Obama had to govern by executive authority in a number of important instances. Those kinds of things are more vulnerable. But there's a lot that the administration also accomplished in setting what the law is and what the standards are. So it's all of us to watch, keep our eye on, things like the issues that you raised, and make sure that to the extent there are any shortcuts, that we're going to be prepared to speak to that and challenge.
Could I just add really briefly that designation, the critical habitat designation for polar bears, that's another Bush administration rule. It was Secretary Kemp Thorne who promulgated that rule, and it's withstood challenge. It will be very hard to undo because it's an Endangered Species Act rule. But more to your question, I think we're all, as in the environmental attorney field, thinking there's going to be a lot of defense to be played in the next 4 years. But I take your question to be asking, how can we also play offense? And that is very much what I at least am thinking about. There should be a way to use the legal tools we have to figure out how to take advantage of the opportunity that's presented itself, to take advantage of the judicial precedent about considering climate change impacts. And that is very much something that an organization like mine is thinking about.
Great. The woman in the purple sweater, you've had your hand up.
I'd like to hear from anyone on the panel who cares to answer. To what extent do you believe or anticipate that the Keystone environmental laws themselves are going to be targeted for repeal?
I'd be surprised. I'd be surprised. Those laws have been enduring. They are typically the classic statute in terms of being quite broad and with providing a lot of room under them for regulatory tweaking. So I think the ball game is going to be in the regulatory sphere. I think that's one area where we've seen, for example, the Endangered Species Act is traditionally one of the acts that gets the most attention as potentially vulnerable, but there's been blocking power on both sides. I actually do think that there'll be some ESA vulnerability associated in the relatively short term with the California water situation and the impact on the Delta smelt and some of the salmon species in particular. So watch that carefully. And if we see that starting to be chipped away, then I would probably change my answer. But for now, I'm hoping that the bulwark of our basic environmental laws will stay.
And I agree with David. I think that, and if you look at some of the key statutes were passed during Republican administrations, right? So I agree with that point, but I do see on the horizon, especially with this focus on infrastructure, that's going to be one of those top three things that have been articulated that the president-elect is going to promote. I see more NEPA exemptions, and I see, just kind of around the margins, but I don't see the new administration trying to do away with NEPA, but the application of NEPA, absolutely. I see that being an area where there could be some erosion.
Okay, final question, so hopefully a short question, right here in the front.
Okay, well, mine is basically more a public relations question than it is a policy or legal question affecting perception of the public. And perhaps the only way to explain it is to recount very quickly a fishing trip that I took for the first time in 25 years on a fishing boat in Florida. I brought all of my equipment except two essential pieces of equipment, Code of Federal Regulations and the environmental regulations of the state of Florida, because virtually every fish on an all-day trip that was pulled up by the 30 or 40 people was a separate legal decision. How big, how long, is it in season, what species is it? And it often was determined by whether the yellow stripe was on the dorsal side or the bottom side of the fish. And this is not funny in that it creates a perception in the mind of the public that environmental regulations can be counterintuitive, obtrusive, and inconsistent. And that is really dangerous to environmental policy, and why someone who's considered anti-environment, such as the president-elect, may well be elected to and remain in office. So what can be done to address this public perception on the multitude of differing regulations emanating from everywhere?
I talked about common sense environmental requirements, and when I discussed the trend lines in the natural resources area, again and again I came to that conclusion that these were common sense environmental regulations. There certainly are areas where environmental requirements are very complex, and President Obama in one of his State of the Union speeches talked about the fact that salmon are regulated by two different agencies and depends on where they are in their life cycle. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I think, though, the regulations you were dealing with were there because there's a tremendous overfishing problem. Mm-hmm. And the reality is perhaps there's a better way to solve that problem, but in some cases, the ESA, for example, and the Magnuson-Moss Act in terms of fisheries are harsh because things are so bad. But it is a good reminder that the public perception is important, and it will be very important that those of us who are concerned about maintaining environmental protections talk about common sense environmental regulations and are willing to be flexible about how that's done in order to protect what we care about most.
And I would just like to add that, you know, the regulations are there so you can go out there and do some fishing, right? What I can see as a trend is to the extent that you have federal, state, and local requirements, because I assume some of those, you know, would be, you know, state requirements or fishing license requirements, there might be a streamlining. There might be a stepping back of the federal role in some cases. The states might have a bigger role in environmental regulation. And now I'm not answering your question about public relations, which I know nothing about, but I am thinking about maybe a tailoring that might come with the, you know, stated burdens of so many regulatory agencies, or, you know, you have the, you know, the state actors, et cetera. So that's what I'm thinking we might start to see at some point. I don't think immediately, but more of a letting the states take some of the primary role, which may or may not be a good idea in some circumstances, especially on the enforcement side and on those programs that really do need to have a national approach.
I'd just say a lot depends on cause and effect. When people see cause and effect, they're more understanding. New York City, when I worked there, and we still do, to have a tremendous effort to try to keep our drinking water clean. When you see a cow pooping into your drinking water, it's sort of fairly obvious that's not a great thing for those downstream. And similarly, when pollution is, for example, affecting the fisheries in Chesapeake Bay, you see the cause and effect. And so limits on the pollution, Chesapeake Bay is still very controversial, but at least it's made some progress because we see the effect. Air pollution, you know, people understand we don't want to be like Beijing. Now that most of it's invisible, it becomes a little harder. So I think a lot is really going to be is how visible are the impacts. Fish are tough because they're underwater. You don't see them. Climate change is the toughest of all because it's hard to say that my pollution is actually affecting you. Think about pesticides. When they kill people, we regulate them. When they just get you sick over the long term, EPA has had a much less aggressive approach. So visibility of cause and effect is really important, and we're going to have to make the reality of that cause and effect more visible.
Yeah, and just to conclude and to agree with Peter, I mean, one of the things that we do at Policy Integrity is trying to make the benefits of environmental regulatory actions visible, quantifying the climate benefits, for example, and I think that will continue to be very important going forward. So thank you so much to all of my panelists. You've done a terrific job.